Hello, and welcome to PremiumBytes, where we shine a light on the unsung world of insurance technology leaders. I am Sudhar Krishnamachary, one of your co-hosts, and with Samir Ahmed, our other co-host, we're here to have meaningful conversations about the evolving technology landscape inside the insurance industry. Let's acknowledge it. Being an insurance firm CIO or Chief Information Officer is one of the toughest leadership roles in today's world. You've got a risk-averse mindset baked into the very fabric of the industry, a legacy estate that must complement the modern tech, and a talent crisis from both the retiring side and next-gen recruiting side. And then you got the slower pace of innovation. We see it because we're right there in the trenches with you as consultants day in and day out. Our mission is to deep dive, have conversations that carry substance, offer practical insights, and help you validate and navigate the relevant challenges of being an effective CIO in the insurance sector. So thank you for joining us on this adventure. Let's jump right into our next conversation. Hey, Samir.
Hi, Sudhar. How's it going?
Going great. It's good to be back, always exciting to go on. This would be episode number 9 as a team. So
yeah, that's
really
right.
Super excited and thrilled, and always grateful for the support that we're getting from our very small niche group of audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we got continue to get good feedback and encouragement from everybody. I think the change of pace with the quarterly news roundup / conference review was a good change.
Yeah.
But back to kind of normal
regular
IT
programming.
leader
So
concerns.
So let me phrase the context for what we're going to do today. A lot of people might remember the MOVEit breach happened almost a year ago, and it was a big event, especially for the financial services and insurance community. But even before that, perhaps the first major event was the SolarWinds event. It was obviously at an infrastructure level, but still, the whole idea of cyber attack, cybersecurity becoming a mainstream was perhaps post SolarWinds. And then I think some of our audiences might have seen some news items in the last week or so where United Healthcare and their Change Health unit had a breach, and you and I were fascinated with the news that I saw last week that they paid a ransom of $22 million. And then coincidentally this morning, as we were preparing for this, there's a cyber attack on a Michigan-based hospital that is apparently threatening their computer networks. And so more of this news is happening every week, and as you start looking, they pop up probably more often than we have seen them in the past. So that prompted us to tee up this whole topic of cybersecurity and insurance.
Yeah, absolutely the case. And coincidentally, over lunch with some of our colleagues, right, at an individual level, just somehow this topic came up as well. And the commentary was that, what's the incremental cost of yet another breach to the individual? Because all my info is already out there because of breach with AT&T and with Target and whoever else. It's already there. What's yet another breach going to do?
You're so right. Who knows? Maybe 5 years from now, nobody's going to care, right? It's almost like, getting spammed in your inbox. Like, who cares about inbox spams, right?
Yeah. But no, not to make light of this. It is a serious topic and concern, and another item that goes under the heading of no one really acknowledges something as long as everything's happening and there's no issue. But the moment some issue comes up, the IT leaders are the ones that face the brunt of these cybersecurity
Absolutely,
issues.
they're tremendously under fire with a lot of this happening. Although I can only imagine, like, if the CEO is up, at the Senate or on CNN, there's probably 5 of these CIOs, CISOs, and security officers, scrambling behind the scenes.
Yeah, for sure.
So which kind of prompts me to ask, like, I'm sure the audience are wondering, like, what exactly are we going to talk about?
Yeah. So look, cyber security, cyber threats, cyber risk, cyber insurance. Right. There's a lot to cover, and as kind of we've committed to all of you, right? We don't really want to just keep things at a superficial level. Want to try and get to some degree of useful depth as we talk about topics. So the only way that happens, right, if we chunk this up. So the way we've thought about approaching this, and our plan is that there's a set of concerns that are for every enterprise, right? What is our own uh, cybersecurity
Right.
concern, right? What is our profile? What should we be doing about our reducing and managing our own cyber risk? And then, of course, to the extent that, all of us are in insurance, right? So there's the element of cyber insurance. So commercial insurers that are offering or thinking to offer cyber insurance, what are some additional concerns or different concerns that come into the picture because of that? So these are at least the two sides of this. One is how to handle uh, at enterprise level cyber security, cyber risk. And then the second is if you're offering cyber insurance, what does that mean? And I
Correct.
think today we'll start with that first part, right? Just as an insurance enterprise, how should we think about an insurance company's own cyber risk?
Absolutely. And as we dive into it, it's important to acknowledge perhaps that it's an emerging topic, but definitely not a brand new topic, right? That's just why at the beginning, like from the SolarWinds to the MOVEit, I think folks hopefully are already beginning to think about it. And the discipline is also emerging, and the practices around it are somewhat evolving. Like IT and security protocols have always been in there. This whole idea of data security, cybersecurity is just another layer on top of it. So the maturity might be different for different people in our audience, but it's an emerging one. And then the last was, like you and I talked about, it's very hard to cover the entire breadth. So hopefully we picked a few relevant, critical insights and or points of consideration for our insurance technology executives to consider.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely not new, but at the same time, not a fully mature discipline. And I'm not even sure, as I say that, what it means to be fully mature, because this is very much a cops and robbers kind of story, right? That you close one avenue, and then the nefarious actors find another one, and you close that, and then they move on to finding the next one, and so it's just a continual, pick your metaphor, right? Game of whack-a-mole or something.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I think this will remain a game of whack-a-mole. So. But in that sense, I thought it was important for us to maybe talk to the most important sub group of our audience. Like, you're a CIO and you know, possibly don't have a CISO. If they have a CISO, they most likely have their ducks in a row and perhaps have a good set of practices in place. But if you don't, I'm sure you have a point of view on a framework of how to think about it if you're a CIO looking for cybersecurity practices and what's everybody else thinking about.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have a framework, but I certainly think that there's a way to think about this, and there's a lot of progress out in the industry. But absolutely, yeah. So organizations, right? To those of you that have built out IT security teams, you all know all of this already. You can probably skip to the next part. But for those of you that are still building this out, right, perhaps if you think of it in terms of what is the highest level of person in the organization that thinks about IT security, cybersecurity, if that's a manager or maybe a director, uh, some of this may already be there, some of it may need to be evolved. There's a lot of work that's been done out there. There's a few different frameworks, driven by payment card industry, health industry, uh, the uh, other standards organizations out there, right? So there are frameworks for how to approach cybersecurity. For today, I figured, right, we can start with the simple idea of there's being ready, being resilient, responding to situations, and then recovering, right? So the 4R model, sometimes it's called. Um, so perhaps we can use that to sort of unpack a
Yeah.
little bit, right? That if I have,
So I guess so. I'm repeating. I'm just trying to repeat what you just said. So it's the 4R model. It's kind of the readiness, the resiliency, and then responding. I guess, and then perhaps when the event has occurred and some damage has been done, how do you recover from it? And I guess there are a certain set of practices within each one. So I guess maybe we start with the first one being more in terms of being ready. What does it mean to be ready?
yeah. So I think at this point in maturity of IT discipline, right? Pretty much everybody does this, but just to put some uh, explicit names to the activities, right? So I think your journey, right, always starts with let's evaluate where we are today, right? What is our current profile from a cyber risk perspective? How well are we positioned, or how poorly are we positioned, or wherever we fall on the spectrum? So usually it will start with some kind of a cybersecurity assessment, and typically you'd hire an outside party to come and do this, and pretty much do an audit and assessment and provide a report of, look, here's different aspects of your enterprise. This is where you're doing well. This is where you've got some risk. This is where maybe you have some issues already that you didn't know about, or maybe you know about, but nonetheless they're still present. So I
I'm
would say, right,
starting
that's
to
that's
chuckle
the
a little
very
bit
first
because I
thing.
guess I'm starting to chuckle because the former professional hackers make a great set of consultants for cybersecurity assessment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, these firms out there, they do have folks like that. It's kind of like the FBI hiring the mastermind of check fraud or something to
That's
help
right.
counter check fraud.
That's right.
Uh,
That's right.
yeah, yeah.
Um,
So that's the first part, right? Just let's you go through the assessment. So the outcome of the assessment is a report, and along with the report is usually some suggestions on how to go resolving the issues that are identified or reducing the risk that's identified. Because with as with most things, right, you can't just tackle all of it all at once.
and these will be
But
typically an involved consulting type, and the scope of this will be, dependent on the nature of the IT estate and the complexity of the organization, how big, how small they are, right? So, while we say it's continuous, perhaps assessment, I guess, at least once a year, if not more frequently than that. Is that a fair set of assumptions to say?
yeah, yeah. So I would say start with doing the initial assessment, and then identify the issues, triage them, start addressing them. And then, of course, once you address some issues, you want to repeat the assessment to confirm that, in fact, the risk level has gone down or the issue has been resolved. But then, these assessments, they will need to be done with some frequency, and ideally, that frequency is continually increasing, right? Maybe you start with once a year, and then you move to We do it twice a year, then once a quarter, maybe once a month. And the North Star should be that I should have a IT estate that is continuously monitored and assessed. And whenever something new is identified, we get notified right away or identified right away rather than, I got to wait for my next security assessment to find out what's changed. So I
Sure.
would say that's really the model that one should have as a North Star and aim to get there incrementally.
Got it. Um, and typically, if you have a CISO, presumably CISO's practices are there, but I would think a CIO or an office of a CIO and their perhaps their leadership team designate should be able to take accountability for this and be able to run with this, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think you definitely need to make this somebody's only responsibility, and that's kind of just going back to that point that when does that responsibility elevate to becoming an officer level responsibility? That it's a journey, right? But this should be a full time responsibility for somebody. Because then it moves to the next thing, right? That okay, we did the assessment and we identified what the main issues are and we resolve them, but then it gets to how do we keep improving this idea of our resiliency, right? Reduce the uh, level of risk points that we have, or the extent of our exposure, so on. And this can apply at three levels, right? One is across the organization, some basic hygiene, right? Cybersecurity, good practices that everybody should be exercising. And I think at this point, again, right, most companies have something like this in place where you have basic training for all employees around how to identify uh, phishing,
Phishing efforts
emails.
or
Yeah,
scams or security practices or whatnot, right?
yeah, yeah, and even
It's
socially
interesting you mentioned
engineered
that. I was just reading
approaches.
that non-malicious attacks are on the rise. What I mean by that, I guess, is that it's not that a malicious entity is deliberately doing it. It's almost like a person inadvertently does some things, an employee or a contractor, and that seems to be on the rise.
Yeah, yeah,
So, a good point about organizational practices
yeah,
at the overall business level.
yeah. So that would be one, right? Then the second one is uh, okay, how do we improve our posture around technology that we're bringing in from the outside, right? Either renting software as a service or buying software and running it ourselves, whatever the case may be, right? We need to think a little bit about uh, how do we improve our practices around that. And we'll touch more on this right as we move past
The second part,
uh, the concerns of a security officer into maybe concerns of somebody responsible for application development or something like
sure.
that. So we'll come back to this, and even the next one, right, the third level, which is to the extent that we're building our own technology, right? How do we improve our practices for that? Right. So these are the three levels of, I think, and there may be other ways to slice it, right? But again, in this kind of rough framework of 4 Rs, you improve resiliency by practices across every employee, some practices around technology that we're buying or renting, and then third one would be technology that we're building.
Yeah. So which leads us naturally to the last part of the framework, and maybe logically they're together is like how do you respond and recover from an incident? I think you and I briefly talked about this, and I don't think the question of if is there or should be there anymore. I think it's just a question of when.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, look, this is one of those things that in lots of areas, right, we go through drills, right? You do go through a fire drill or a tornado drill or what have you. and increasingly, right, going through cyber attack drills and cyber attack drills of various kinds have started to become a thing. They're not, I would say, just mainstream at this point, but certainly they're on the rise, and I think IT leaders should start thinking about this because there's a lot that goes into it, right? That you got to know that something happened. Now that you know something happened, what is the next step that you take? And very simple thing, right? Should I unplug my system from the network? Should I power it down? Or no, should I let it run? Should I let it stay connected, right? Which is the right thing to do. And it may not be one of them is correct, universally. It may be, depending on the context, you have to make a call on which way is.
I I intuitively think disconnecting it from the network will create less damage, but I can't imagine a scenario where keeping it connected and let it run might be more productive.
Yeah. So disconnecting from the network and keeping it powered on, don't power off the device is the typical, rule of thumb, if you
Right.
will. But look, I'm not a cybersecurity expert, so
Yeah, neither of us are, and that's the beauty of this discussion is that I
yeah,
think we're in the same tent as our audience because nobody except for the CISOs and the certified people, a lot of what we can say and think about is just still commonsensical stuff.
correct. Yeah, and that is the point, right? That there should be an established protocol for okay, when this event occurs, and it is a matter of when. This is the protocol we're going to follow, and that protocol will include internal communication, external communication. Uh, you know, do I have to engage some kind of public relations, because of it? What is my communication protocol? Um, you've got a cybersecurity issue going. If the only mechanism you have to communicate is through email and Slack and these kinds of things, but your network's compromised, so your communication channels shut down. What is your alternate communication channel? In the moment is the absolute worst time to figure it out. It should be figured out ahead of time. So
It's
so this all
again
goes under kind of the response, kind of immediate, let's say 24, 48, 72 hour window from an incident, right? What are the activities that should occur then? And
in
it may
the
be
in
shorter, longer, right, depending on the event, but
true.
yeah.
Again in the spirit of this recovery and responding in recovery, when I read the news article about the United Health CEO admitting that he personally approved the $22 million ransom, the first thought that occurred to me is, uh, you know, do you have to like get the board's approval for this? I presumed yes. But even more than do you have to tell the FBI about it, or would the FBI already know about it? And so these are like very commonsensical questions that I had. And the only reason I bring all of this up is that if you're a CIO or a senior officer in a reasonably big company, you better start thinking through this because sooner or later you may be in this spot, right? Or your CEO will be in this spot, and you would have to help.
Yeah. And look, companies go through this, right? I'm sure all of you listening in are familiar with tabletop exercises and the like. So it's not that we don't do this. It's just a matter of, right, consciously going through and making sure we cover more and more uh, points of potential response.
And there's also more and more regulatory scrutiny depending on the scale and scope of this. So it's until it happens, the regulators don't probably scrutinize as much. But then as soon as it happens, like all radars are underneath your hood, so to speak. And
Yeah,
and
yeah, and
I
it is, and it's increasingly, coming under kind of purview of audits that are done of companies, either voluntary audits or even mandatory audits. So They are coming under the
And
fold of that.
the again, I'm just using the United Healthcare and Change Health example as a multi-factor authentication presumably was the reason, and as soon as it happened, somehow magically they were able to implement MFA in a shorter period of time, but until it happened, it wasn't implemented.
Yeah. I mean, look, even this is not a silver bullet, right? Because people are getting MFA fatigue now, multi-factor authentication fatigue. All right, let me put it this way, right? In an hour, how many times do you have to use a code that came through on your phone, right? And what is
Absolutely,
the
more and more.
what is the
Yes,
degree with which you scrutinize that text message with a request for the code or whatever action it's asking you to take?
that's
The
right.
fatigue is setting in too. But anyways, right, to maybe just move along a little bit, right? So response is the immediate aftermath, right? Put some time frame around it, but after that, right, you have the recovery, and recovery depends on what occurred, right? Because some of the I mean, ultimately, right, this comes down to there's either um, some data has been stolen, or you're being extorted by your data being kept hostage, or perhaps your data has been destroyed, right? Ultimately, a cyber incident, right, uh, at the root of it, it's one of these three aspects. So depending on what occurred, your recovery will then be based off of
Have to
that.
be, yeah.
So
Okay. Again, the larger the organization, the complexity and the volume of data, and the amount of third party data that you hold, and consumer data and PII data that you hold, all of this can exacerbate or contain the nature of. And again, back, maybe ransom is or paying the ransom is probably the only resort you have in order to either protect or recover, right?
yeah, yeah.
So
So this is the concerns of, right, the person responsible for security within the organization, right? They have approaches like this and frameworks like this that they follow, and these practices that they implement, and then try to increase the intensity of the activities and the breadth of them, so on. But then there's the second side of this, right? That so if you're an IT leader, but you're not responsible for security, perhaps you're responsible for data, perhaps you're responsible for application development, perhaps you're responsible for architecture, right? So uh, that's maybe the second part of what we can cover
absolutely,
here
right.
today.
A lot of our support for the podcast and the audience group is primarily people a level below CIO, like a VP of IT or a director of IT, and they own a portfolio of applications or a set of third party systems that they manage. So I am assuming their priorities are a lot more different than what a CIO would do. So I would think the first thing that pops in my mind if you're in that level is either you already have one, or you hopefully will quickly develop a strong partnership with whoever is running IT security as a shared services, or if there's a CISO office, the office of the CISO, from a cyber practices standpoint, right?
Yeah, I think everybody is either already experiencing it or should begin to experience this. That just like uh, folks receive requirements and mandates, even at some level, from different parts of the organization, uh, there will be similar requests and demands and mandates from IT security. So partnering with the partnership of the two is absolutely, I think, critical piece. And part of that, right, is sort of in the security circles, right, folks talk about this idea of shift left mindset within application community, development communities that move security concerns not after all the application development is done and systems are implemented, but move them earlier and earlier into the process, and ultimately all the way as far left as when you're bringing in the software or you're building the software, you have security in the mind and as part of your process right from
So I guess
the
from a
beginning.
so I guess where you're going is from a I guess a DevOps sec to a sec DevOps.
Yeah. Some of these acronyms, right, have the progression has been there definitely. That there was DevOps and there was SecOps, and then they merged into DevSecOps. And the shift left is that no, you start with a secure mindset first, so SecDevOps. I mean, some of it is philosophical, but practically speaking, yes, that's how it manifested itself.
And do you think the topic closer to our heart is this idea of even architecting an application to be with sound security practices? Is that do you see that as a separate component of it, or somewhat embedded in this sec dev ops?
Yeah, look, we've talked about how architecture and agile coexist sort of in a separate episode. And any of
Correct.
you that are interested, I would point you back to listening to it. I'll put the episode number in our notes. But this idea of architecture impacts from security, not just development practices. I think it comes back down to right where does architecture fit in the organization? If it's a centralized architecture outside of development, then yes, these patterns like zero trust architecture, for example, will start come as uh, patterns and practices and sort of part of reviews of architecture. But to the extent that you have architecture embedded within delivery teams, it's closer to development patterns. Anyway, there's both, right? There's some uh, we go back to kind of our favorite people, process, technology, and data sort of framework.
Sure.
Um, I think all of that applies. That there's as a leader in IT, right? I have to think about what are the skills that our folks have as it relates to security practices and processes. Then it's, well, what are those processes themselves? So where in our software development or where in our, if not development, but software selection, right? Where are steps that didn't exist before that now we have to introduce?
Introduce security practices or security concepts.
Correct. And maybe to make it real, right? So for instance, uh, and this may go into the third bucket around technology for this purpose, right? That, well, I write some code and it gets compiled and I find out how well it ran and what issues it has, so forth. But part of that now is, you invest in static code analysis tools that will review the written code and provide an assessment of there's some risk of vulnerability because of a certain programming idiom that was used, and it prompts the developer, right? It stops the developer from putting that code into source control before, so they're forced to fix it. So this is an example of using a new kind of technology, a static code analysis tool that's changing your development process, which then leads to people becoming more skilled, right? That, okay, well, my code is going to get dinged by the code analysis tool, so I better not write that code to begin with. So,
How does I'm
anyhow,
just a curiosity question as we do this, maybe the idea of bringing MOVEit back in here, thinking loud here, but MOVEit was a very naive, simple software. If you needed to transfer files between a partner or other parts of the organization or systems, some applications were leveraging this tool. And as an application owner, when you have software that you're developing, but you're also using some software from third parties as part of your own work, it can get fairly quickly complicated, and inadvertently things can go wrong, right, in the future, depending on how we architect and integrate.
Yeah, look, when everything is custom developed, right, your risk is limited to what you have done or
What you
not
do,
done.
right? Yeah.
And in this phase of the API economy that we are in, right, uh, a system is basically a stitched together set of API enabled components. And so every little piece of technology that is behind the API is part of your risk profile. And some of it may be your own, but some of it may be external. Some of it may be commercial. Some of it may be a partner, right? Whatever the case may be, the increasing connectedness definitely increases the surface area of risk. But maybe two-part here, right, that we can quickly touch on. That from a you know from the perspective of me owning a portfolio of applications inside an insurance company, if I'm bringing technology in, I have to go back to that partnership with IT security around what is a good approach for assessing the strength, cyber strengths and resilience of that third-party software that I'm planning to use. This could be a framework, this could be a platform, this could be software as a service, whatever it may be, right? It should go through some kind of a review. And then to the extent that I'm building software, right, I also have to go through a similar set of introducing new patterns and processes into the mix.
Yeah, that makes
Yeah.
a lot of sense. And
One
part of
one
this is
one
also,
part. Sorry, one part just to add on, right? So people, process, technology. We cannot forget about data because ultimately, right, this is what everybody is after with cyber activity, right? Either stealing data or holding that data hostage for ransom or destroying it. Um, so it's one thing to have security in the software. There's also patterns and processes on securing the data itself, right? Encryption at rest, encryption in transit. How do you handle your backups? All these kinds of things have to be thought about. Some of it is infrastructure level, but some of it comes back into the portfolio of, the director of apps dev, for example, has to think about data. It's not just your data management team that has to think about this.
I think the reality is that despite a lot of the lower stack level components being automated, this is still a highly people process technology intertwined set of issues, right? One cannot rest that it's highly automated, or I'm on AWS cloud, so everything is safe. No, you could still have a process that can expose, or a low skilled or an unskilled person inadvertently introducing something despite the technology being a lot more sophisticated, right?
Or a highly skilled and highly trained person just having a momentary lapse, right? In fact, your level of skill, you cannot rest your on that, right? That I'm fully trained, so I'm immune to these attacks. In fact, sometimes you're more prone and susceptible to them because you have this false sense of confidence stemming from it.
Yeah,
But hey, look, we're kind of running towards
that's quite
the
great. So let's
close of
we'll
our
close
planned
this.
time.
Hopefully this was a good a beginning opening topic for this. Uh, Again, acknowledging the fact that the cyber activity is increasing, but at the same time, the idea of security has always been there. It just that it is intensity is increasing. So it is with the AI and digital transformation, and a lot of these things are just foundational, and they all there have their own tracks of intensity progressing in the space of insurance and technology. So hopefully we'll continue the next episode on this follow-up topic that we discussed, right?
Yeah, definitely right. That kind of our whole sort of purpose here is to somewhat empathize with the unsung nature of insurance technology
Absolutely.
leaders.
Thanks for reminding that.
That
Yeah,
that no, we're not saying that there's something brand new that has come up, but it's yet another concern that is just continuing to increase in its intensity and its breadth and it's a foundational thing, right? It's not just a peripheral concern. But yes, right. So to the extent that none of this scares you, you're well in control of your own, cyber risk. Perhaps you're in the category of insurers that are offering commercial insurance, and you want to dip your toes into cyber insurance. So what does that look like, right?
yeah,
Stay tuned for the next episode where we'll talk about what
yeah.
changes, what stays the same, and what is just completely brand new.
Suddenly, you're an insurer and a cybersecurity expert and a cybersecurity consultant and a technology wizard, all embedded into one. So I envy the people who are running cyber insurance product portfolios.
Yeah, look, it's a fascinating space, right? I think some people will not touch it with a 10-foot pole, and others will look at that right there is the opportunity to, provide a service in the market where the need is clearly there, but no one is, or few are filling it. So
So maybe we'll open it up with that comment from the Berkshire Hathaway, and we'll end it right there. But we'll begin the next one right there on this comment that you made, that it's a blessing and a disguise at the same time, right?
yeah, not sure if you all listening in, caught wind of it as we're recording. The annual meeting of Berkshire Hathaway happened earlier this week, and one of the items there was a question about why, within the Berkshire family, cyber insurance is not being offered, and Ajit Jain, right there, head of insurance for Berkshire, basically said that they do not plan to touch it. And
Yeah,
then I think Warren Buffett commented further. Any of you that are interested, perhaps I can put a link to that segment.
absolutely. We can put a link there, and then we'll use that as a segue to start the next episode. But listen, thank you, everyone. We appreciate the support. We look forward to hearing your comments and feedback and suggestions. As always, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And we'll look forward to speaking with you again, Samir, on the next one.
Yeah, till next time. Take care.
And that's a wrap for today's conversation on PremiumBytes, where we shine a light on the unsung world of insurance technology leaders. Thank you for joining us on this adventure and being part of our community. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, and follow us. Until next time, take care.